Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Today, I speak with Chris Carnie, founder of Factary, Europe's leading prospect research agency, instructor in fundraising at the University of Barcelona, director of Fundacio Terra, and author of 3 books on fundraising and philanthropy, including his latest, How Philanthropy Is Changing Europe. I spoke with Chris about his personal and professional journey, which started in Scotland and eventually led him to Spain, the generosity he's witnessed along the way, and how nonprofits can be the leaders of change in the years ahead.
Well, why Spain? It's a very good question. I mean, it was a number of factors all coming together at once. The principal motive was that my partner Jordan and I have traveled quite a bit anyway. We traveled in Latin America and I traveled in Africa and so on. My travels partly linked to my work with NGOs. And when we had kids, we just really wanted them to experience a different culture and particularly to get off the island of Britain. The kind of initial thing was, well, we both spoke Spanish because we'd both been in Latin America. So, let's go to Spain. Then we started looking into it. And in fact, what we did was we sold our house in England and we bought a van and a tent. And we headed off to Spain with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in a van and a tent. And we spent 6 months traveling around Spain, looking at all the different corners and wondering where it might be nice to live. And Spain is, of course, fascinating. I mean, it's like the USA in a kind of miniaturized version, in the sense that it's really a single nation or a single state, made up of lots of different cultures or nations. So, the Catalans are different from the people who live in the south in Andalusia, and they're different. People who live in Euskadi, the Basque people on the Atlantic coast, and they're different from the Galicians who live in the northwest corner, and all of them are different from the people who live in Madrid. So there's lots of different cultures in this one country, and yeah, we spent 6 months traveling around looking for a place to live, and eventually deciding on Catalonia and Barcelona as the place for us.
How is that going with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old?
Well, it was fantastic, of course, because you get to play your way around Spain. It's lovely. It was a great adventure for them. I think it was a fantastic learning experience for them, in the sense that they've become, as now veteran travelers. They travel everywhere. They have almost no fear of traveling. So my daughter is currently in Africa, and my son is in Sweden, and so I think that was great. But it was lovely to see Spain through children's eyes. It was really, really fabulous.
Your eyes must have been wide open, though, as well, because, as you say, you both spoke Spanish, but my understanding is the Spanish in Latin America, let alone all the different cultures, because they are so various there as well, is quite different to what you would experience in Spain. So what was it like for the two of you, not only with small children, but with a tent, going to a place where the language was very similar, but the culture may have been unique unto itself?
Well, this is what we found, that in each of the corners of Spain and the center, as it were, the culture was quite distinct. The sort of incredibly relaxed and wonderful early evening stroll that you take when you're in Seville, in Andalusia, in the sunshine between the orange trees. It's super relaxed, and you stop at a little bar and have some tapas and a glass of wine, and then you stroll on and maybe have another one later on. That's very different from the kind of hustle and bustle of where I am speaking to you now from, which is central Barcelona, which is very businesslike and very business focused, and people are cramming as much as they can possibly into every possible hour. And that again is different from Galicia, the northwest corner, where again, without stereotyping too much, where there's an Atlantic, a sea-based culture, and people left from Galicia, in fact, to go to the Americas and elsewhere. So there's a sort of quite perilous sea-based culture up there. So those things were all different. The language was, of course, different from the language we learnt in Latin America. But then, of course, we settled in the end. We lived for the last now 22 years north of Barcelona near a little village, which is a Catalan-speaking village. So we had to then learn Catalan. And that was, a great experience because the kids learnt it first. They absorbed it and sort of picked it up faster than we did as adults. And so we had this situation where our children could speak a language that we could not speak. So we'd go to the shops, and the butcher or the greengrocer would say something, and I would say to my son, "What did he say?" and my son would explain it to me in English. So it kind of reversed the polarity. Normally, with the adults know everything and the children know nothing, that kind of idea, which I don't agree with anyway. But anyway, that's the sort of general picture. But in our case, the kids knew everything and we knew nothing. So it was a great reversal of power in parenting.
This desire for travel, that must go way back for you. Where are you from originally?
So I was born in Glasgow and then brought up on the west coast of Scotland, on one of the lochs on the west coast of Scotland, Loch Fyne, so a sea loch, and spent my first 18 years in Scotland, leaving then to in fact go traveling. I traveled around Italy with a friend on a bicycle, and that was beginning of me traveling on my own. Travel is such a wonderful thing to do because of the humanity that one meets. The human beings that one meets, the people, the variety of people, and the almost universal, incredible generosity of people when one is traveling. People who invite you into their homes in all kinds of different places and them in all kinds of conditions. I mean, Jordan, my partner, and she and I traveled, she and I walked down the sort of spine of the Andes about 30 years ago. And we would stop in tiny little houses and be invited inside by people who had really nothing, and they would share their almost nothing with us. So travel really for me is a sort of reinforcement of the idea that we humans are fundamentally generous.
Maybe that's a way for us to talk about another piece of your story, which is your work in philanthropy. But even before we go there, you were from Glasgow, as you said, from Scotland, and then you took it sounds like these miraculous trips, but you went to school. So where did you study, and what did you study?
Well, that's the sad part, Jay. I'm afraid I'm from the classic middle class, perhaps even upper middle class in Scotland, which is a very small club of people in the end. And so I went to private school, to boarding school from the age of 8 to 18, which was not a great experience for me. I mean, I learned a lot, and I went on from there to other things, but wasn't a great experience. But that's what one did. That's what happened to people in my class, and one had the experience then of really living in a very, very, what was then and probably still is quite, really closed society. One was living in a bunch of people who never really looked out beyond their middle class locations and values. And in fact, what happened to me, Jay, was that, and this is perhaps a little bit of an explanation of what then happened to me. What happened to me was when I was 19, I fell in love with a wonderful German woman who took me for the very first time to poor parts of Glasgow. I'd never actually entered the poorer districts of Glasgow. And she took me to, first of all, a market called the Barras market in Glasgow, which is a sort of market for secondhand goods and other things. And then she took me onto other places where I saw how people were living. And I suddenly realized then that there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were living in great poverty right next to where I was living in great comfort, Mm-hmm. And that one day changed my life. That was the day when I decided to focus on poverty as the thing that would, the thing that would drive me through the rest of my life. And that's what I've done.
I know that some of your early work was at organizations like, I think, muscular dystrophy and voluntary service, a hospital and so forth. Was that an extension of that? Did you look for an opportunity that might give you a chance to work with others in those ways? Or was that kind of happenstance? How did that start?
Well, I went to university. I got my degree. I got into the sort of standard rotation or the standard sort of offers of jobs. At the end of that, I took a job in a bank, rather foolishly, hoping that it would teach me how to run my own business so that I could set up a business that would employ people and reduce poverty. And it was a tragic mistake. And I lasted a year in the bank, didn't like it at all, and looked around for something more wholesome. And that was when really having that even that the career existed, or the job existed, I saw a job as a fundraiser for the muscular dystrophy campaign, and joined them and spent 4 years with them and learned fundraising trade as we did at that point, entirely on the job. So I organized events, and I organized direct marketing campaigns, and I organized appeals to trusts and foundations and companies, and one just did everything, and learnt the trade there, and then subsequently, as you say, with voluntary service overseas, and with King's College Hospital in Camberwell.
It's funny, some people, when they interact with fundraising, they have two different reactions. And one is that they see that as an avenue to do these things, to address, for example, poverty or illness or so many different things. But others approach it with cynicism. They think about the money and the nature of having to ask people to do things. Or you were new to this. I know it was coming out of the world of banking, but you had this view of the world, it sounds like, where you really wanted to make a difference. You really wanted to help people who had a lot less than you had grown up with, that you had discovered. So your reaction to fundraising was what? And how did you meld those ideas so you felt comfortable with the idea of being a revenue producer on behalf of charity versus, let's say, going into the field and working somewhere?
Well, fundraising was and still is, for me, the perfect job, because I'm good at selling stuff. I could have become a secondhand car salesman, or indeed have sold banking products, I suppose, if I could have faced the moral dilemma. But fundraising. This morning, I was at a meeting with one of the sort of significant philanthropists here in Barcelona, and talking to him about his philanthropy. And I was pitching to him a couple of projects I'm involved in that I think he might well be interested in. And I love it. I love being able to sell people stuff, but know that the stuff I'm selling is going to do good. I mean, what on earth's better than that? I'm not selling them some, useless gas guzzling car. I'm selling them something that's really going to make people's lives better. And if I can use my sales ability, I won't use the rude word that I might use about how I talk about things, but if I can use my selling ability to make one person's life better, then that's me. I'm really happy.
So as you made that journey through a number of organizations, and I guess in a relatively short amount of time, having that experience, how did you then move over into this other world of research, which has been such a big part of your professional life?
I mean, with Muscular Dystrophy Campaign, I got involved in what was then called the Year of Disabled People. And through that, I'd met a member of Parliament, a Labour Party member of Parliament, Alf Morris, who became Lord Morris. And he asked me to become his research assistant. So I was a fundraiser during my days, and I would go each evening or 3 evenings a week. I'd go to the House of Commons and work for him as a research assistant on issues to do with human rights, essentially human rights abilities. And that got me, I mean, the House of Commons Library is a unique source, which is unfortunately not available to the general public, a unique source of information about pretty much anything you care to look into. And I got fascinated by the research and researching things and researching ideas, and realized that fundraisers were beginning to take an interest in bigger donors, perhaps just trusts and foundations, but also wealthier individuals. I mean, this is a long time ago. This is in 1990, and realized that perhaps it'd be useful to be able to do some research and find out more about these foundations and more about these people, and inform the fundraisers and therefore help their fundraising. And that was the origin of Factary, which is the company I set up in 1990 to do what we now know as prospect research. I didn't know it was called prospect research until during 1990 I got in touch with a wonderful person called Helen Brown, who you know very well. And Helen told me the thing you do is called prospect research, and we've been friends ever since. So yeah, I got involved in research initially doing prospect research, but I find the whole world of philanthropy so interesting. The motives of people. What is it that makes someone decide whether they're wealthy or actually not all that wealthy, whether they're just modestly comfortable? What is it that makes them decide, I'm going to give away this, or half of my wealth, or 10% of my income, or whatever it might be, to good causes each year. I'm completely fascinated by people and how they arrive at those decisions, and so my research has broadened into the whole area of philanthropy, and as I say, the motivations and the kind of people behind it, and the motivations and the structures and so on that we have in philanthropy.
And before we get too far away from your work there, working with the House of Commons, I have to say that, again, people will often, when they wish to make some kind of difference in the world, will sometimes pursue the world of social good, and sometimes they'll pursue politics. And you had a taste of it working, it sounds like, what is the equivalent of the U.S. Congressional Research Service or something like that. And that sounds like it was a pretty profound experience. What did it do to your impression of politics and its role in addressing the needs that you saw and imagined? And how was that different or complementary to, perhaps, maybe even sometimes competitive with, the interests of nonprofits, third sector organizations trying to address those same issues?
That's interesting. I mean, I did think at various points about going into politics, but I always much preferred the agility and the flexibility and the sort of innovation that I saw in the nonprofit sector. And I've always felt that the nonprofit sector has been able to react much more quickly to social issues, social concerns, and resolve them rapidly. What politicians have is the power to scale that up. We as charities and nonprofits, we can intervene in a social setting, whether it's in Africa, or whether it's in the back streets of Boston, or wherever we can intervene in a social setting and set up models and ways of working and so on that function and demonstrate they function. But and eventually we will need the power of politics and the power of governments to be able to turn that modest project or program into a nationwide project or program, or a nationwide change in policy, or whatever it is that's required. So the two go hand in hand. But I infinitely prefer the small size, the flexibility, the humanity of the nonprofit sector as against the sort of gargantuan business politics. And what I saw with Lord Morris was that he was a man of extraordinary principles. He'd fought for the rights of people with disabilities for years and years and years. An absolutely constant, fighter for that, and a very moral individual. But even he had to squander his morals, or tailor his thinking to the needs of the party, because he needed the party to push through the policies that he was promoting. And indeed, he managed to push through the Disability Rights Act in Westminster. But that, he needed the party mechanism to do that. So he had to be part of the party, and therefore he had to subscribe to the party's views, even if they didn't quite agree with his own views. So, that kind of accepting the need to be part of a bigger group, even though it goes against your morals, I would find that pretty difficult. I prefer my slightly neater, smaller, NGOs where we can establish what our values are and share them and stick with them.
It's interesting because in the world of nonprofits, in this world of charity, some of those pressures do still sometimes exhibit themselves. And again, this was early in your career, but having a taste of business at the bank and then a taste of politics, and seeing the compromises that ensue in order to either produce revenue or produce policy or law. Do you see those things also in the nonprofit world when we either intersect with institutions, the government for grants, the corporations and foundations for gifts, or even individuals in trying to raise revenue?
Absolutely. And when I'm teaching fundraising and philanthropy, I teach here at the University of Barcelona and at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia. When I'm teaching this, we talk a lot about this, for me, incredibly narrow path that we as fundraisers have to walk along, which is we are the commercial sellers of the product. That's what we do. But goodness me, we have to be really careful how we express that, how we do that, how we use that, and who we talk to, because unlike selling a car, we're offering we're trying to get the individual, or whether she's the individual donor, whether she's the president of a company, or whether she's the boss of a foundation, we're trying to get the individual to come alongside and share our values and our vision. So it's just not the same as a sort of off the shelf product. It's a very morally and ethically very narrow line that we tread as we try and persuade someone to join us without selling up on our beliefs and giving up on our beliefs. And I mean, what's interesting in very recent years has been, of course, the degree to which business has woken up and said, we too should have values. We too should think about what our purpose is. And, we've got the idea now of purpose-driven businesses, that we too should think what our purpose is. And it's not just about maximizing profits for shareholders. There are other stakeholders here who we should think about too, including our community and our employees and the environment around us and so on. And so I'm seeing this really fascinating convergence. And I actually think, business is waking up to the fact that we in the nonprofit sector have been doing this stuff for years, and they need us now to help them work out how they can be a business which is driven by a solid, clear purpose and with solid values, and at the same time sell product, because that's what I've been doing for years.
This idea about the convergence is fascinating as well, and I would like to talk with you more about that. Before we move on from it entirely, though, you did start telling us about the factory and founding that in 1990. And for those who don't know the factory, can you describe what it was meant to be, as well as what it became? And also what the environment was like for doing that kind of work in 1990 versus the kind of research that we know today in the nonprofit world?
Well, There was no environment in the UK in 1990 in terms of, no one had ever heard of the idea of prospect research. It was a completely ridiculous idea. And I spent at least a year and a half, frankly, living on the earnings of my lovely partner, because I wasn't earning really almost anything at all, trying to pitch this idea to to charities. Luckily, things have improved since then. So, Factory, the original conception of what happens now is pretty similar. The original conception was that we would do, I and then others would do research into potential donors for nonprofits, and help nonprofits understand these donors better, with the intention that they would be able to be more effective and successful in their fundraising. It was as simple as that. It luckily it did take off. It grew. It grew. So we're now a team of people in Bristol. I mean, it grew slowly initially, but then grew a bit more rapidly. We're now a team of people based in Bristol in England, and we carry out exactly that kind of prospect research. In other words, sort of name by name prospect research. We also do quite a number of studies. So people are looking at should we develop a fundraising program in Brazil? Well, we can do a study on the current philanthropic situation in Brazil and see what's going on, and then report back to the NGO on what the potential is there. And we also do database analysis, looking at donors and identifying donors with high potential. That piece has, of course, gone through an enormous revolution because of the provisions of the European Data Directive, which very much limit what we can do with data and how we should handle data and how we store data and everything else. All, in my view, for the good. But we have developed new and completely compliant methods of data analysis, so that we can analyze databases and as I say, help charities to pick out the people with potential. So it's fundamentally prospect research, market research, and data analysis is what we offer in Bristol. And then I act as a consultant, working typically on major donor programs, helping organizations to develop their strategies, develop their case, and really develop their understanding of these weird and wonderful people who are philanthropists.
So those weird and wonderful people are understood very differently today from the way they were then, and in the middle of that arc of that journey, because I think you were probably relying a lot on very early stage digital resources and a lot of print and good old fashioned detective work when you started. It must have been in 1990, and then in the middle of that you had a very large database of gifts that you'd built, that you then determined, I guess your interpretation of the European Data Protective would not allow you to use in the same manner. And then today, as you said, the scope is different, but you seem to feel it's better. So I'm curious, as you look at that arc and you say that you think it's for the better, why is that so? How is the environment today preferable for philanthropy, for the donors, for all of us working in this field?
Okay, well, let's separate those two questions, Jay, because there's one question there around data, and there's another question there around how philanthropy is evolving. So the second one I shall spend 3.5 hours lecturing about. But the first, I can give you a fairly brief answer to. The data protection legislation, I mean, none of us were doing, and I'm not just speaking here about Factory, I'm speaking about prospect researchers in general in the UK. None of us were doing anything bad. We were all very concerned about the kind of morals and ethics of what we were doing. We were very, very careful with the data we were using. But we were using data compiled by organizations with purpose X, and we were applying it to purpose Y, without the knowledge of the person, what they call the data subject in the European legislation. And eventually something had to crack. We had and others had built up databases of names and addresses of people with money, to put it bluntly. and we'd done that on public domain sources, and we'd done it carefully, and we tried to be ethical and so on. But nonetheless, this was a list of people at their home addresses with stacks of money, and they didn't know we had that data. To be completely blunt about it. So in fact, what happened was a sort of actually quite manufactured scandal driven by a tabloid newspaper in England called the Daily Mail, which created a sort of scandal around the idea that poor old Mrs. Jones was being asked for millions by Charity X because they'd been told by somebody, some screening company, whoever it was, that Mrs. Jones was very wealthy. And this turned into sort of parliamentary questions, and David Cameron, and then Prime Minister, got involved, and so the whole thing blew up into quite a big storm. All of us in the prospect research community realized that we couldn't go on doing this, and we had to think of other and better ways of doing this. And in fact, what we did was we simply destroyed all our data, the whole lot, and started again from zero, in conjunction, in compliance with the government body in England, which is responsible for, or was, when we were part of the EU, responsible for applying the European Data Directive, which is called the Information Commissioner. In conjunction with them, we devised a whole new way of looking at data in which we had no names at all, but which we used address and geodemographic data to help us identify better prospects, and then use other forms of research to find out more about them. So it was a major turmoil in the sector. The Information Commissioner at the time, her team handled it in a very, very aggressive and rough way, and then walked away from the charity sector, without looking backwards, as it were, leaving us all in quite a lot of disarray. The newspapers, of course, once they'd sold their millions of copies, then dropped us. They weren't interested in us after a very short while. But it did force this change. And in terms of it being for the good, we'd been running a system which we all felt all right about. And again, I'm just talking across the range in prospect research, but which had a lot of cracks in it. The principal crack being that Mrs. Jones didn't know that we had her name on our or anyone else's database, and that had to end. And I'm very glad it did. And in fact, what we've done with the new techniques, it's forced us to devise new techniques which actually are better, and we're getting better results with our data analysis than we ever had before. So it's worked out for everyone for the good overall. So in terms of data, that was a significant kind of moment of change in my life and our lives. In terms of your bigger question about philanthropy, there's lots and lots of wonderful changes that have gone on. And if I may, I just mentioned that I have written a book about this called How Philanthropy Is Changing in Europe, which was published a couple of years ago. But there's lots of significant changes. It's hard to pick out which are the most important. I mean, first of all, I'm based here in Catalonia, in northeastern Spain, and caridad, which is charity, the original idea of charity here, which is what's been running here for years, is essentially a religious requirement to give to the poor. And what has developed here literally in the last 20 years has been philanthropy. In other words, a thought through moral, personal desire to make the world a better place. And so, for example, the guy I was meeting this morning is a modern philanthropist. He runs a charitable foundation which his family have set up. He has a strategy around his philanthropy. He measures impact in his philanthropy. He tries to attune his business interests to his philanthropic interests. In other words, the thing I said before about more like purpose-driven businesses. He actually prefers not to use the word philanthropy. He prefers the phrase social investment. There's been the most amazing change in this one corner of of continental Europe in the last 20 years. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be involved with the European Venture Philanthropy Association. So I've seen, right from the very beginning, I've seen the development, the really burgeoning growth of venture philanthropy as a model here in continental Europe. So the sort of attitudes that go behind venture philanthropy, in other words, the idea of an investment, the idea of an investment you can pull out of, the idea that you measure impact, the idea that you get engaged with the cause that you're supporting, the idea of using clever forms of finance. You might use a loan, or you might use quasi-equity or whatever to engage with the social problem that you're trying to resolve. This sort of stuff, it wasn't no one even thought of that 20 years ago, and here we are in this fantastically and fascinatingly changing world of philanthropy here in Europe. There you are. That's 3.5 hours and 3 minutes.
Well, that just means that everybody has to read the book as well, which is a good thing. But yeah, I know that probably in the book you address a number of things, not only the change and all those positive aspects, but what the terrain looks like for philanthropy going forward. And this central question about is it growing or is it shrinking? Is it addressing the needs that people are identifying or not? And you work a lot on the environment, I understand now, and that's a central issue for many organizations, but not for all. It's also something that's led to kind of complexities in how individual nations are addressing their policies, as well as how they're doing it collectively, either loosely associated or tightly linked. And you've lived through Brexit. Yeah, I mean, actually, I guess the European Union coming together and then Britain leaving it. So as you look at all that, how are you seeing philanthropy as a contributor, a growing contributor to those positive changes? And where, maybe the better question is, what still frustrates you? Where do you see an opportunity for a philanthropy that it has not yet embraced to address issues like the environment?
Well, I think one has to start the answer to that question with a bit of realism. I mean, there are around 8,000. I think there's around 8,500 charitable foundations here in Spain. I mean, let's talk about Spain. I can talk about other European countries as well. The map is quite similar, but there's thousands of registered charitable foundations. The number of those foundations that I would say are running, modern, impact-focused, strategic philanthropic programs is, I mean, it might be 200 or it might be 300, but it might be even 500 conceivably, but it's not much more than that. In other words, there is a huge tail in charity. Well, let's call it charity. And a huge tail in charity of organizations that are still very, very stuck in the charity model and are still largely managed along very sort of old-fashioned pyramidal lines. And there's just a lot of backwater in the world of charity in Spain, and I'm absolutely not criticizing Spain there. The same is absolutely true in Italy or France, in Germany, in the Netherlands. In continental Europe, this is a very common pattern. There's sort of few leaders and then a long tail behind. And so it's not a frustration. It's actually a sort of almost a vision or a job. How to get more of those organizations moving ahead, moving forward in terms of the way they think and the way they manage their charity and their organization. And that's partly what's drawn me into teaching. So I teach and I give classes and master classes and talks and so on. And I love that because I hope I'm moving people forward a wee bit. The other, and also because I learn so much when I'm doing it. Of course, I learn so much about what people are doing, and sometimes it's amazing what they're doing. The other part of this is, though, this convergence. If we'd said to a French business owner 20 years ago. You've got your business on the one hand, and you've got your donations on the other hand. We would like to talk to you about merging those two things, about bringing those two ideas together, those two sets of values together, and drawing your business and your charitable world together. She would have been horrified, because the ethics in France particularly, but also in most of continental Europe, was that your charity was stuff that you did. It was very private, very secret. You did not talk about it to anybody at all. You certainly never boasted about it. You often did it anonymously. And it had to be completely separate from your business activities. The biblical idea that the left hand shouldn't know what the right hand is doing. And what's happened, and it's in large part thanks to the models drawn up and created by the venture philanthropists, has been this incredible convergence between business and philanthropy. So again, another philanthropist I know here, who runs a large pharmaceutical concern here, he has totally decided to focus his business and his charity. They have a family foundation, on the same stuff, on making lives better for people. And the profit part that he would probably describe as the social profit that results from the things he's doing. That's just a ginormous change from how things used to be and how things used to be seen. So there is this incredible future, I think, of bringing together businesses that really want to, business leaders particularly, that really want to, business people, let's call them, they really want to make change, that really get the idea around purpose and social purpose for companies, bringing them together with all of us guerrillas and the guerrillas, in the Spanish sense, who are working in the non-profit sector and doing better for society and the environment through that convergence. And of course, in the business sector, that there's always going to be some nasty profit only kind of guys and girls, but hopefully we can move enough of the sort of leading businesses toward this converged model that we can start to make an actual difference. As you said, I'm working with a small foundation here in Barcelona called Fundacio Terra, Terra, meaning Earth in Catalan, of course, which is focused on the climate emergency, and which is a personal passion and a wonderful place to be working. And I'm looking out at a business community which is getting more and more and more interested in environment, in the impact that they're having, in looking to reduce impact. And some of it is greenwashing, of course it is, but a lot of it is actual, real human beings in organizations that really want to make their organizations change. And I think that bodes really, really well if we can get the shift moving fast enough.
I want to ask you about another thing that we've all just lived through, and I understand it may have been particularly painful in Spain, and that's the pandemic, which continues as we speak, but not the way it was. How was that for you, for your family, and for that matter, for the sector? Because if fundamentally it's about helping other people, it was not an easy time to try and help other people when we're also trying to help ourselves and our families. How was that experience for you? Well,
so many people carried on helping other people despite having serious problems in their own families. I found it in that sense, a really wonderful and reassuring reminder that, that as I said before, humanity, I think, is fundamentally generous, and there's so many examples of people helping others in so many ways, and I'm sure you saw them all the way across the US as well. People, making sure their neighbors got fed, bringing food for them, cooking meals for them, looking after family members while someone was in hospital. I mean, there's just so many cases of that. And the charity sector, certainly in Europe, the big foundations particularly, they did a pivot straight away and started focusing on people who are suffering and people who are in need and trying to help out in many ways. I mean, at home, well, I live in an old Catalan farmhouse, 2.5 miles away from the nearest village, in 12 acres of forest, with 4 donkeys, 6 sheep, and assorted chickens and 2 dogs. So our actual, life at home didn't change that much. We had to go out every day and change and feed the donkeys and feed the sheep and make sure everything was all right and, dig the trenches and all that sort of stuff. So life did, in that sense, didn't change that much. And we were very fortunate in not being touched in my direct family by COVID at all. But of course, it changed the way I work. So for years, I've been getting on aeroplanes about once a fortnight and flying to Geneva or Amsterdam or Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Mexico or wherever as a consultant, and going and working with organizations face to face and trying to work out how they could improve their work with philanthropists and develop strategies for philanthropists and so on. And of course, instantly that stopped. And I actually realized that quite a lot of that traveling I really, really could have done, as we're doing now, on a Zoom call. I really didn't actually have to go to Geneva that time to meet those people. I could have really done it on a Zoom call and saved a lot of time and energy and burnt hydrocarbons in the atmosphere and everything else. So I became, much more home-based of it. It was fully home-based, of course, initially as COVID hit, and then, gradually traveled a wee bit more. And now I'm much, much more circumspect about traveling. If we can do the job on Zoom, it saves the client time, it saves the client a lot of money, it saves the environment. So I'm very happy to work like this at distance. Although, of course, one discovers the limitations of that, and there is something about human contact, about giving someone a hug or giving someone a handshake or whatever, which is impossible to reproduce online.
When we began the conversation, you talked about going to places where people shared their nothing with you. And it strikes me that kind of sharing can take place in so many different ways. And whether you're living as you are now, or you're in a big city somewhere, that there are lots of different avenues for people to share that natural generosity. Do you think that anything we've lived through in the last couple of decades will inform the way that people express that generosity going forward, especially because fundraising itself has changed a little bit, right? It changed in terms of how we deal with prospect research, as you've described. It's changed in terms of whether or not you need to jump on a plane and go and see somebody for a solicitation, perhaps. Do you imagine that we are going to change and evolve and improve? And if so, what does that look like?
Boy, I sincerely hope we do, because we've got a lot of evolution to do. I don't have a crystal ball, Jay. I can't tell. And we've had sort of sudden shocks recently, like this terrible war in Ukraine and so on. So I can't sit here and say how I think the future is necessarily going to be. I think fundamentally, this gets us back to the topic I started off with poverty. I think fundamentally, and here we cross over probably into an area of politics. I think fundamentally, what's been demonstrated in the last 20 years is that this pure neoliberal model that your Ronald Reagan and our Margaret Thatcher brought into politics just doesn't do the job. It just doesn't allow the majority of people to lead decent and comfortable lives. It allows a very few people to lead very comfortable and very luxurious lives. And thankfully, some of those are wonderful philanthropists, but it doesn't let the majority do that. And I think the evolution that I see is absolutely inevitable, because I can't see this current neoliberal system as being sustainable. I think the evolution that's absolutely essential is that we learn to share out resources in a much fairer way. And charities have been showing for years how to do that and what to do, and they've learned how to manage it and everything else. But it's, again, we're back to, scale, how to put that up to scale, and that's down to governments to do. So I can't see this current system surviving. I think it's absolutely not sustainable, either in terms of poverty or in terms of environment. So I think we have to change. And what I'm not sure is where that change will come from, how it will be affected. I mean, we're seeing right now, for example, we're seeing protests in the Middle East against authoritarian regimes. We're seeing a war in Ukraine in which a country is holding out against an authoritarian regime. We're seeing, and we're going to see this winter, certainly in Europe, a lot of civil protest because of the rate at which prices have risen and wages have not. So I think we're going to see, the protests, whether that leads this year or whether it leads next year or in 10 years' time or 20 years' time to a change. It will, I think, have to lead to a change in the way we organize our societies, because there has to be a fairer way of distributing the goods amongst everybody. In part because, as has been shown repeatedly by organizations like the OECD, the neoliberal method just it doesn't work in terms of cost. It costs more to run an economy under those neoliberal guidelines than it does under a fairer set of guidelines. The wealth gap in itself is a costly luxury that a few countries maintain. So I think and hope we're going to see change. I think that, again, the nonprofit sector can really lead that change, because we've been doing this stuff for years. We've been redistributing wealth. We've been, helping drag people out of abject poverty. We've been working with the HIV/AIDS positive person on the street in Barcelona, which is, I've also volunteered here with organizations working on HIV/AIDS. We've worked with people on the streets here in Barcelona. We know what the underbelly of civilization is, and I think we can be leaders of change the minute that the governments become receptive to those ideas.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.